Hey everyone, Dr. Shook here. In this video, what I want to talk to you about is hypothyroidism, so low thyroid function, due to pituitary, which is a gland in the brain, hypofunction or low function. So we're going to talk about hypothyroidism, low thyroid hormone, due to the pituitary gland not working properly. If you've seen any of my other videos, I'll explain to you how the physiology, the body produces and stimulates the production of thyroid hormone. It all starts in the brain at a central structure called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus detects when the blood levels of your levels of T4 are low or high, and it adjusts the output of a hormone called TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. It adjusts it. It will increase it if the levels are low. It will decrease it if the levels are high, which TRH stimulates the pituitary gland, which is the brain right here behind between your eyes, right behind your skull here, to produce TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to ramp up production of T4 and T3. Okay, so when those levels are up, the hypothalamus is detecting and listening. It's detecting the levels of T4 and T3 in the blood, and if there's high T4, T3, then the hypothalamus decreases the output of the hormone, slowing down the pituitary gland, decreasing the output of thyroid stimulating hormone, because if these levels are high, there's no reason to stimulate more production, so TSH goes down. So the TSH is what's commonly ordered by your doctor to screen for your thyroid dysfunction. In this pattern, well, it's important to know this one relationship first. When T4 is low and T3 are low, TSH, if this feedback loop here is working, if the brain can detect the levels that are in the bloodstream appropriately, if the feedback loop is working, then if these T4 and T3 are normal or high, TSH should be lower, because you don't need stimulating hormone of the thyroid if the levels are high enough, right? So they're inverse. And then if these levels are lower, if the T4 and T3 are lower, then the brain's going to detect a need for hormone and signal the pituitary gland to make more TSH, so TSH rises, because it's thyroid stimulating hormone, so we want more TSH to stimulate the production of T4 and T3, which would be low. And the idea is that they're balanced, right? That the system works appropriately and that you have a normal, balanced amount. Okay, so what happens in this pattern is that the pituitary gland does not put out TSH. It doesn't make enough TSH to stimulate the thyroid, even though there's a need for it. There's not enough hormone here, and the TSH yet is not rising. So your T4 and T3 are low, but the TSH output isn't high enough to stimulate the gland. Now, why would the pituitary gland decrease and not make enough TSH? Okay, well, we're going to talk about, this is a functional hypothyroid pattern. We're not talking about pathology of the pituitary where there's no TSH. We're not talking about pathological. We're talking about, these are very common functional patterns that I'll see in practice, that we can support most of these nutritionally and help to support improving this physiology rather than just taking a medication. So let's look at this pattern in a little bit more detail. So when you see that this pituitary gland is not making much TSH, well, first of all, let's talk about how we detect it on labs, right? So on labs, what we'll typically see is a TSH, which remember, this is the marker that's usually checked by your doctor. TSH will be 1.8 or below, but it won't be hyperthyroid low. It won't be typically 0.45 is the bottom of the lab range. It varies from lab to lab, but usually we see it around 0.45. If it's below that, it's more suggestive of hyperthyroidism and could be a different problem altogether. And it's not usually this pattern. But usually if it's below 1.8 and the TSH is below 1.8, meaning TSH is lower, right? But it's not quite so low that it's hyper or suggesting hyperthyroidism, which is too much thyroid hormone. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the total T4, so the total T4 that's made, and usually it will show as TT4, or it'll say total T4, or total thyroxine, it'll be below 6. Okay, so lower than 6 with the TSH at 1.8 or below 1.8. Okay, but not too low. So this is what you'll typically see on the labs: low T4, lower TSH than you would expect. You would expect if T4 is lower, that TSH would be higher. Okay, that's what you would expect to see. So what might be happening here is that there's suppression of the pituitary gland where it's not making enough TSH. So why does that occur? What might be causing that? Well, let me share with you the things that typically cause that. The potential causes for this type of pattern, number one, is going to be stress. So prolonged stress or an active stress response, what your body does is your pituitary is, it drives the production of cortisol. Okay, so cortisol is a stress hormone that's made by your adrenal glands. Now, the pituitary gland is involved in signaling the adrenal glands to make cortisol. So if you're under stress, you're constantly asking the pituitary, make hormones, signal the adrenal glands, and you do that with repetition, you can fatigue the pituitary gland and you can decrease its ability to output TSH. So what you'll see is that stress in an active stress response can cause TSH suppression, okay? So that's number one. Now, number two is postpartum. So the demands of pregnancy require the pituitary gland to do a tremendous amount of work and orchestrate all of these hormonal changes in the body. It's very demanding. So a lot of women, when they're going through pregnancy, it places a tremendous amount of demand on the pituitary gland that can fatigue the pituitary and result in suppressed TSH. Now, one of the other things is you got to consider this. These things can happen together, right? So what if the mother is stressed? They're already stressed and under a tremendous amount of stress going into pregnancy. Then they get pregnant. They're carrying a baby. They have all these demands of pregnancy that are these hormonal demands of pregnancy that fatigue the pituitary. They've got stress on top of that and higher cortisol that's also fatiguing the pituitary. Then, postpartum, they can actually have lots of problems, and it can result in suppressed TSH and this pattern where there's lower T4 and the TSH is just not responding. This feedback loop, typically, if these are low, this feedback, the hypothalamus is sensing and detecting the levels of T4 and T3 in the blood. If they go low, then it's going to pump out more thyroid releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary, to make thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid. So this feedback loop can either stimulate, the hypothalamus can stimulate production or it can slow down production, depending on the levels here. So what can happen is these things can definitely dampen and suppress the pituitary, and then it can result in low thyroid function, even though it's not really a primary thyroid problem. It's actually due to the pituitary gland. Okay, so over medication. All right, so if you're overly medicated, here's another thing that can occur. So with being overly medicated, one of the things that we'll see happen is if you have too much T4 or too much T3, what ends up happening is instead of just becoming hyperthyroid, like you think if you take more and more thyroid hormone, it's just going to make you more and more hyper. Well, it's not the case. There's a point when you start exceeding these the levels that are optimal for the body that you can actually create thyroid receptor resistance. So it's where you have so much thyroid hormone that these cells of the body don't stop taking it up as well. They become resistant to it. There's just so much, they become less sensitive to it, and it can actually cause hypothyroid symptoms. Now, what happens is when you have higher levels of thyroid hormone in the blood than you need and then that are optimal, what it can do is if that happens for a prolonged period of time, the hypothalamus just says, hey, I don't need to make thyroid hormone. There's always enough here. I don't need to make it ever. And what can happen is you can lose this feedback loop, and then the hypothalamus will stop producing adequate TRH to support the pituitary, and the pituitary gland will just not make enough TSH to stimulate the production of T4 and T3. Okay, so over medication could result in suppression, and then if you stop taking the meds, it may not come back because the feedback loop has been broken. Okay, it's been broken through prolonged exposure, and in those cases, you might need thyroid hormone for a long period of time. But the thing is that we can support a lot of these problems nutritionally and help to improve these patterns. And that's not something that's typically addressed, right? The only tool that's really used is the prescription of T4 and T3, and that's it. Not really an understanding or appreciation in a lot of cases for this. And it's not that your doctors don't care. They definitely care. A lot of them do know these things. It's just that there's not a tool that they have to give you. So that's why we use nutritional tools that have been shown in the literature, scientific literature, to support improving these endocrine feedback loops. And we work with diet. We work with improving the person's overall systemic health so that we can work on decreasing the stress response, improving the hormonal signaling. And then obviously we look at a lot of thyroid hormone markers to try to get a better idea of your need and appropriateness for those hormones, so we can better determine whether or not you might be getting too much. And obviously, if we see laboratory high ranges, that's a potential problem. So anyway, I want to share this hypothyroidism, so low thyroid function, due to pituitary gland, which is the gland that produces your TSH, which is most commonly measured. Hypofunction or low function. Okay, this is the second pattern that we're going to cover. I'm going to cover a few more. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, just let us know and post comments for us below, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Hope you guys have a great day. Thanks.